Hatchet Chapter 4. The memory was like a knife cutting into him, slicing deep into him with hate. The secret. He had been riding a 10-speed with a friend named Terry. They had been taking a run on a bike trail and decided to come back a different way, a way that took them past the Amber Mall. Brian remembered everything in incredible detail, remembering that the time on the bank clock in the mall flashing 3:31, then the temperature 82, and then the date. All the numbers were part of the memory. All of his life was part of that memory. Terry had just turned to smile at him, and Terry had just turned to smile at him about something, and Brian looked over. Terry's head saw her. His mother. She was sitting in a station wagon, a strange wagon. He saw her and did not see him. Brian was going to wave or call out, but something stopped him. There was a man in the car. Short, blonde hair the man had, weaving some kind of white polo over a tennis shirt. Brian saw this and more, saw the secret, saw more later, but the memory came in pieces, came in scenes like this. Terry smiling, Brian looking over his head to see the station wagon, and his mother sitting with the man, the time, the temperature clock, the front wheel of his bike, the short blonde hair of the man, and the white shirt of the man, the hot hate slices of memory that were exact, the secret. Brian opened his eyes and screamed. For seconds, he did not know where he was. Only the crash was still happening, and he was going to die. And he screamed until the breath was gone. Then silence filled the sobs as he pulled in the air, half crying. How could it be so quiet? Moments ago, there was nothing but noise, crashing, and tears. Screaming, now quiet. Some birds were singing. How could birds be singing? His legs felt wet and he raised up on his hands and looked down at them. They were in the lake. Strange. They went down into the water. He tried to move, but the pain hammered into him, and his breath shortened into gasps, and he stopped, and his legs were in the water. Pain, memory. He turned again, and the sun came across the water. Late sun cut into the eyes and made him turn away. It was over then, the crash. He was alive. The crash was over, and I'm still alive, he thought. Then his eyes closed, and he lowered his head for minutes, which seemed longer. But he opened them again. It was evening, and some of the sharp pain had abated. There were many dull aches. The crash came back to him fully. Into the trees and out onto the lake. The plane had crashed and sunk in the lake, and he had somehow pulled free. He raised himself and crawled out of the water, grunting with the pain of movements. His legs were on fire, and his forehead felt as if someone had been pounding on it with a hammer. But he could move. He pulled his legs out of the water and crawled on his hands and knees until he was away from the soft shore and near a small stand of brush of some kind. Then he went down, only this time to rest, to save something of himself. He lay on his side and put his head on his arm and closed his eyes, because that was all he could do now. All he could think of being able to do. He closed his eyes and slept, dreamless, deep and down. There was almost no light when he opened his eyes again. The darkness of the light was thick, and for a moment he began to panic again. To see, he thought. To see is everything, and he could not see. But he turned his head without moving his body and saw across the lake the sky was a light gray, and the sun was starting to come up, and he remembered it had been evening when he went to sleep. Must be morning now, he mumbled, almost in a hoarse whisper, as the thickness of sleep left his world came back. He was in pain, all over pain. His legs were cramped and drawn up, tight and aching, and his back hurt when he tried to move. Worst was a keening throb in his head, and pulsed with every beat of his heart. It seemed like the whole crash had happened to his head. He rolled on his back and felt his sides and his legs moving through things slowly. He rubbed his arms. Nothing seemed to be shattered or even sprained all that badly. But when he was 9, he had plowed a small dirt bike into a parked car and broke his ankle. He had to wear a cast for 8 weeks. And there was nothing now like that. Nothing broken, just battered around a bit. His forehead felt massively swollen to the touch, almost like a mound over his eyes, and it was so tender that when his fingers gazed at it he nearly cried. When his fingers grazed it, he nearly cried. But there was nothing he could do about it, and like the rest of him, seemed to be brushed more than broken. I'm alive, he thought. I'm alive. It could have been different. There could have been death. I could have been done. Like the pilot, he thought suddenly, the pilot in the plane, down into the blue water, strapped in his seat. He sat up, or tried to. The first time he fell back, but on the second attempt, grunting with the effort, he managed to come to a sitting position and scrunched sideways until his back was against a small tree where he sat facing the lake, watching the sky get lighter and lighter with the coming dawn. His clothes were wet and clammy, and there was a faint chill. He pulled the torn remnants of his windbreaker, pieces really, around his shoulders and tried to hold what heat his body could find. He could not think, could not make thought patterns work right. Things seemed to go back and forth, but between reality and imagination, except that it was all reality. 1 second he seemed to only have imagined there was a plane crash, that he had fought out of the sinking plane and swum to shore, that it all happened to some other person or in a movie playing in his mind. Then he would feel his clothes wet and cold. His forehead would slash a pain through his thoughts, and he would know it was real, that it had all happened, but all in a haze world. So he sat and stared at the lake. He felt the pain come and go in waves and watched the sun come and go over the lake. It took an hour, perhaps 2. He could not measure time yet and didn't care, for the sun to get halfway up. With it came warmth, small bits of it. At first, with the heat came clouds of insects, thick, swarming hordes of mosquitoes that flocked to his body, making a living coat of his exposed skin, clogged his nostrils when he inhaled, and poured into his mouth when he opened it to take a breath. This was not possibly believable. Not this. He had come through the crash, but the insects were not possible. He coughed them up, spat them out, sneezed them out, closed his eyes and kept brushing at his face, slapping and crushing them by the dozens, by the hundreds. And as soon as he cleared a place, as soon as he'd killed them, more came, thick, whining, buzzing masses of them, mosquitoes and some black flies that he'd never seen before, all biting, chewing, taking from him. In moments his eyes were swollen shut and his face puffy and rounds to match the battered forehead. He pulled the torn pieces of the windbreaker over his head and tried to shelter it, but the jacket was full of rips and it didn't work. In desperation he pulled his t-shirt over to cover his face, but the exposed skin made his lower back, and then the mosquitoes and flies attacked the new soft flesh of his back so viciously that he pulled his shirt down. In the end, he sat in the windbreaker, pulled up, brushed his hands, and took it, almost crying in frustration and agony. There was nothing left to do, and when the sun was fully up and heating him directly, bringing steam off the wet clothes and bathing him in warmth, the mosquitoes and flies disappeared. Almost that suddenly. 1 minute he was sitting in the middle of a swarm, the next they were all gone and the sun was on him. Vampires, he thought. Apparently, they didn't like the deep of night, perhaps because it was too cool and they couldn't take direct sunlight. But in that gray time in the morning, when it began to get warm before the sun was fully up and hot, he couldn't believe them. Never in all of his reading, in the movies he had watched or the television about the doors, never once had they mentioned the mosquitoes or flies. All that ever showed up on the nature videos was beautiful scenery or animals jumping around and having a good time. Nobody ever mentioned mosquitoes and flies. Ugh. He pulled himself up to stand up in a tree and stretch, bringing new aches and pains. His back muscles must have been hurt as well. They almost seemed to tear when he stretched, and while the pain in his forehead seemed to be abating somewhat, just trying to stand made him weak enough to nearly collapse. The backs of his hands were puffy, and his eyes were almost swollen shut from the mosquitoes, and he saw everything through a narrow squint. Not that there was much to see, he thought. Scratching the bites in front of him lay the lake, blue and deep. He had a sudden picture of the plane, sunk in the lake, down and down in the blue, and the pilot's body still strapped to the seat, his hair waving. He shook his head. More pain. That wasn't something to think about. He looked at his surroundings again. The lake stretched out before him. He was at the base of the L, looking to the long part, where the short part was to the right. In the morning light, calm the water and absolutely perfectly still. He could see the reflections of the trees at the other end of the lake. Upside down in the water, they seemed almost to have another forest, upside down forest to match the real one. He watched a large bird, he thought. It looked like a crow, but seemed larger. Flew to the top, real forest, and the reflection bird matched it. Both flying out and over the water. Everything was green, so green, it went to it. The forest was suddenly made up of pines and spruce, with stands of some low brush smeared here and there, and thick grass and some other kinds of brush all over. He couldn't identify most of it, except the evergreens. Some leafy trees he thought might be aspen. He'd seen pictures of aspen in the mountains on television. The country around the lake was moderately hilly, but the hills were small, almost hammocks, and there were very few rocks except to his left. There lay a rocky ridge that stuck out overlooking the lake, almost 20 feet high. If the plane had come down a little to the left, it would have hit the rocks and he would have never made the lake. He would have been smashed, destroyed. The word came. I would have been destroyed, torn and smashed, driven into the rocks and destroyed. Luckily, he thought, but I have luck. I had good luck there. I knew that was wrong. If he had good luck, his parents wouldn't have divorced because of the secret, and he wouldn't have been flying with a pilot who had a heart attack, and he wouldn't be here where he had to have the good luck to keep from being destroyed. If you keep walking back from good luck, he thought, you come to bad luck. He shook his head again, wincing. Another thing not to think about. The rocky ridge was rounded and seemed to be some kind of sandstone with bits of darker stone stuck on it. Directly across the lake from it, as the front corner of the L, a mound of sticks, mud rising up out of the water with a good 8 to 10 feet. At first Brian couldn't place it, but then he knew that he somehow knew what it was. He had seen it in films. There was a small brown head. Then a small brown head popped onto the surface of the water near the mound and began swimming off to the short leg of the L, leaving V of ripples behind him, and he remembered where he'd seen it. It was a beaver house. It was called a beaver lodge, in a special he had seen on a public channel. A fish jumped. Not a large fish, but it made a big splash near the beaver, as if to signal. There were suddenly little slops all over the sides of the lake, along the shore, as fish began jumping, hundreds of them, jumping and slapping at the water. Brian watched for a time, still in the half day, still not thinking well. The scenery was very pretty, he thought, and there were new things to look at, but it was all green and a green and blue blur, and he was used to gray and black of the city, the sounds of the city, traffic, people talking, sounds all the time, the hum and whine of the city. Here at first it was silent, or he thought it was silent, but then he started to listen, really listen. He heard thousands of things, hisses and blurks, small sounds, birds singing, hum of insects, splashes from the fish jumping. There was great noise here, but a noise he did not know. The colors were new to him, and the colors and the noise mixed in his mind to make such a green blur blue that he could hear a hissing pulse sound. And he was still tired, so awfully tired, and standing had taken a lot of energy somehow, had drained him. He supposed that he was still in some kind of shock from the crash, and there was still pain, the dizziness, the strange feeling. He found another tree, a tall pine with no branches until the top, and sat with his back against it, looking down on the lake, the sun warming him, and in a few minutes he scrunched down and was asleep again.